Dear Prudence, greet the brand new day. Hey, the sun is up, the sky is blue. It's beautiful, and so are you, dear Prudence. Won't you come to play? Dear Prudence, let me see you smile. Dear Prudence, I'm like a little child. The wind is low, the birds will sing that you are part of everything. Dear Prudence, won't you open up your eyes? Look around, round, round. Look around, round, round. Look around, round, round. Look around, round, round. 40 seconds left. Hey guys, let me see you smile. I'm so glad you're here. Hi, Sean Brown. Hello, Caden. Welcome from Grandma and Grandpa's house. Good to see you. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. Or no, sorry, 50 seconds. It's good to see everybody here. So happy. Thank you for being here. Got to do some eye warm-ups. Won't you let me see you smile? He decided to get really close today. It was a little windy outside. Okay. Ow! I'm so happy to see you guys. It's really good to see you. Sorry, I don't mean to be wobbling. I should get that stuff all figured out. It's been a good day for learning. You guys been working hard. Dear Prudence, love this song. Okay, let's get started. I think it's time. Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen. John O'Keefe here. Chapter 10 is starting. As you guys are getting yourselves warmed up, I want to touch base with you. I want to say good day. I want to say thank you for being here. I want to thank you for loving reading enough to join me on this awesome adventure that Billy is having. I also want to share with you that you should be getting yourself pretty much ready to go in regards to your reading spot. Your reading spot should be almost ready to be shown off. Hopefully, like my friend Phil, who noted me last night, that this is something that him and his sweetheart are listening to. But then he is now reading out loud to her as she does some different craft work and needlework, if I'm not mistaken. And so that is great. That's exactly what this is supposed to do. It's supposed to be an inspiration to lead you to read your own book or read out loud to somebody else, because I find that reading it out loud really brings it to life. I hope that you all are doing well. It's a little bit super breezy outside. One of the things that I noticed about today is that it's so breezy that it would have been hard to probably hear me. And so I decided to come on inside and say hello. This is a different part of the house, and so I want to give you a little bit of background. I think that this is kind of a cool one. I want to introduce you to the crow. This is a picture, actually. I'll just do a real quick introduction. You'll see that that crow is strangely kind of walking with a pair of boots on through a field with some grass hanging out of his mouth or her mouth. I often have said it's a he, but I don't know if that's what you would agree or not. I want to say that my sweetheart, Miss Rainey's mom, has the same picture in her house. So when I go visit her out all the way out in Washington State, then I'm seeing the same thing that's in my house. And so that's really cool. So it was kind of a gift between them. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to read. There are people here. There are people saying, okay, Mr. O, it's time to get going. So here's my challenge to you. Before we get started, do you have your paper? Do you have your picture? I want to give massive props to Eva Mallory and Anna Mallory, who have been sending me some of their pictures, which has been great. Hello, you guys. Twins sitting listening to the same thing, but having two different versions of their expression of what this experience is. And the cool thing is that they could probably do a pretty dang good job of doing some sweet summarizing in regards to it. And so thank you very much for being a part of that as well. I have talked enough, and I will let the words do the discussion from now on. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. Chapter 10. Woo, double digits. Are you ready? Ooh, what happened yesterday? There's a new coonskin on the smokehouse wall. The big tree is down. Billy succeeded in keeping his word. Thanks a lot to Grandpa, who keeps bringing in some really cool stories. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Chapter 10. I have no idea where we're going today. Mama made me a cap out of my first coon hide. Ooh, now he's got a nice little fuzzy cap that's going to go along with it. I was as proud of it as Papa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Mama said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me, because in some way wearing that cap must have affected my mind. I went coon crazy. I was out after the ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when the weather was bad, and even then Mama all but had to hog tie me down. What wonderful nights those were, running like a deer through the thick timber of the bottoms, tearing my way through stands of wild cane, climbing over drifts and jumping logs, running, screaming and yelling, "Hooey! Get 'em, boy, get 'em!" following the voices of my little hounds as they trekked through the woods. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there were none that prowled the riverbanks that could ever fool my little lamb. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coonskins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth $4 to $10, depending on the grade and the quality. I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I would spread them out a little to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never on the backside. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. The money earned from my furs was turned over to my father. I didn't care about the money. I had what I wanted, my dogs. I suppose that Papa was saving it for something, because I never saw anything new turn up around our home. But like any young boy, I wasn't bothered by it, and I asked no questions. I wonder what his dad is starting to save money for. Have we heard anything? Have we learned anything? I'm not quite sure if I remember anything, but plain and simple, Billy doesn't care. It's not about money for him. It's the love of the hunt. It got so about the only time I ever went to see my grandfather. Ooh, I almost skipped an entire paragraph. I wasn't bothered by it and asked no questions. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want them to go with me, and that was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed as if they all wanted to jump on old Dan. I got so about the only time I ever went to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. This was always a problem. In every way I could, I would try to slip away from my dogs. Sometimes I swore that they could read my mind. It made no difference what I tried. I couldn't fool them. One time I was sure I had outsmarted them. The day before I was to make one of my trips, I took my furs out to the barn and hid them. The next morning I hung around the house for a while and then nonchalantly whistled my way out of the barn. I climbed up in the loft and peeked through a little crack. I could see them lying in front of their doghouse. They weren't even looking my way. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through the back door and walking like a tomcat, I made it to the timber. I climbed a small dogwood tree and looked back. They were still there and didn't seem to know what I had done. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed for the store. I was walking along singing my lungs out when they came tearing out of the underbrush, wiggling and twisting and tickled to death to be with me. At first I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and all was forgiven. I sat down on my bundle of fur and laughed till I hurt all over. I couldn't scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. Kissed a girl? Wait, let me read that. I could scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. Now I get it. He would not do anything to treat them unkind, as much as he denies the fact that he probably would never kiss a girl. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I'd never seen him do this with other hunters, and it got the best of my curiosity. One day, while he was writing, I asked him, "Why do you do that, Grandpa?" He looked at me over his glasses and said, kind of sharp, "Never mind. I got my reasons." Sorry. Over his glasses. "Never mind. I got my reasons." When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push things any farther. Besides, it didn't make any difference to me if he marked on every piece of paper in the store. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was Coon Hunters' Day. I didn't have to stand around on the outside of the circle anymore and listen to the coon hunters. I'd get right up in the middle and say my piece with the rest of them. I didn't have to tell any whoppers of stories from some of the things that my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter told honest to goodness lies. He just kind of stretched things a little. You know what they call that in figurative language world? When you stretch a story just a little too much? Do I, did I, did I hear somebody say hyperbole? Hyperbole. 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 It is an exaggeration. Like when you say that you maybe caught a fish this big, but you tell everybody you caught a fish this big. That's a hyperbole. So it sounds like they're telling some tall tales out in the coon hunter circles outside of Grandpa's store. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa would never say anything while I was telling my stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, he'd come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My face would get all red. I'd cut my story short, fly out the door, and head for home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my two dogs. Some of those remarks I heard made me fighting mad. I never saw hounds so small, but I guess they are hounds. At least they look like it, Billy. I don't believe little Ann has as half smarts as he says she is. She's so little, those old coons think she's a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up on them before they realize she's a dog. Some of these nights, a big old coon is going to carry her off to his den and raise some little coon puppies. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil, just like the water in Mama's tea kettle. Whoa, it made my blood boil. That's an idiom. Your blood can't boil for real. It's not possible. Well, at least not in your body. But when you get so mad, your blood feels hot. And it's a simile because he compares the blood to a tea kettle that Mama has that boils water on the inside. So listen to that. Listen to that. I love it. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like the water in Mama's tea kettle. I had one way of shutting them up. Let's all go in the store, I'd say, and see who has the most hides for sale in there. It was true. My dogs were small, especially little Ann. She could walk under an ordinary hound. In fact, she was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, nobody could have told that she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with our chickens and the young calves with a piece of paper or a corn cob. What my little girl lacked in size, she made up in sweetness. She could make friends with a tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around with a belligerent and tough attitude. Although he wasn't a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long and his chest broad and thick. His legs were short, big, and solid. The muscles in his body were hard and knotty. When he walked, they would twist and jerk under his skin. He was a friendly dog. There were no strangers to him. He loved every single one of the dogs that he met. Yet, he was a strange dog. He wouldn't hunt with another hound other than little Ann, or another hunter, not even my father. The strangest thing about old Dan was that he would not hunt, even with me, unless little Ann was with him. I found this out the very first night I tried. Little Ann had cut the pad of her right foot on a sharp, jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot to keep her from following me. I locked her in the corn crib. 2 nights later, I decided to take old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me down to the river bottoms and disappeared into the thick timber. I waited and waited for him to strike a trail. Nothing happened. After about 2 hours, I called to him. He didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and I went home. I knew he'd be able to find his way back. Coming through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in a ball on the ground right in front of the corn crib's door. I immediately understood. I walked over and I opened the door. He jumped up that crib, smelled little Ann's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and lay right down next to her side. As he looked at me, I read the message in his friendly gray eyes. You could have done this a long time ago, Daddy. I never did know if little Ann would hunt by herself or not. I'm not sure she would have, for she was a smart and understanding dog, but I never tried to find out. Little Ann was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her. They would take her down to the creek and give her baths. She loved every minute of it. If Mama wanted a chicken caught, she'd call little Ann. She'd run the chicken down and hold it with her paws until Mama came. Not one feather would be harmed. Mama tried old Dan once. Before she got the chicken, there wasn't much left but feathers all over the place. By some strange twist of nature, little Ann was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in her growth, or maybe because she was the runt in a large litter. That may have had something to do with it. During the fur season, November through February, I was given complete freedom from work. Many times when I came home, the sun was high in the sky. After each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. The flint rocks and sawbriars were hard on their feet. With a bottle of peroxide and a can of salve, I would doctor their wounds. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coonhound so determined, or one that could get into so many predicaments. More than one time, It would have been the death of him if it hadn't have been for smart little Ann. One night, not long after I had entered the bottoms, my dogs struck the trail of an old boar coon. He was a smart old fellow and had a sack full of tricks. He crossed the river time after time, finally swimming to the middle and staying in the swift current. He swam downstream. Knowing he would have to come out sometime, my dogs just split up. Old Dan took the right side of the stream and little Ann worked the other side. I came out of the bottoms onto a gravel bar and stood and watched them in the moonlight. Little Ann worked downriver, and then she came up. I saw her when she passed me going up that riverbank, sniffing and searching for the trail. She came back to me. I patted her head, scratched her ears, and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. She waded in and swam across over to help him. I knew that coon had not come up out of the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I walked up to a little riffle in the river, pulled off my shoes, and began wading across. My dogs worked the riverbank up and down. They circled far out into the bottoms. I could hear the loud snuffing of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad. I was getting a thrill from it all. I had never seen them fooled this bad before. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across to the side little Ann had worked. I knew that it was useless for him to do that. Little Ann never misses anything. I was on the point of giving up, calling them to me, and going elsewhere to hunt when I heard the bawl of little Ann. Hoo! I couldn't believe what I heard. She wasn't bawling on a trail. She was sounding the tree bark. I hurried down the river. There was a loud splash. I saw old Dan swimming back by this time. Little Ann was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight, I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. Then I saw a sight that makes a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled, "Hoo!" He couldn't wait until he reached the bank to tell little Ann he was coming. Far from out in the river, he told her, "I'm coming, little Ann, I'm coming." Reaching the shallows, he plowed out of the river onto a sandbar, not even taking time to shake the water from his body. Again, he raised his head and bawled, "Hoo!" He tore out down the bank. In a trot, I followed him, whooping to let him know I was coming. Before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. Hold on a second. Are you telling me that old Dan's voice was so loud that it made the timber, the woods, shake? Is that real? Or is that one of those hyperboles we were talking about earlier? I think it might be a little bit of an exaggeration. But to a hunter, listening to his dogs bawl like that out there probably was pretty amazing, huh? So I can see why Billy wants it to make it sound like it's such a good moment. Makes it good for us to read, too. The tree was a large birch tree, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away at the footing, causing it to lean over the side. The lower branches of the tree dangled in the water. I saw how smart this old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in toward the bank from the midstream, he had caught the dangling limbs and climbed up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stared there in the birch, thinking that he had outsmarted my dogs. I couldn't understand how little Ann had found him. It was impossible to fall the tree toward the bottoms. It was much too off balance. So this tree now is leaning like if this was the river right here, and it's leaning off the side and it's leaning over the river, right? So how is he much too off balance? I did the next best thing. I cut a long elder switch. Unbuckling one of my suspenders, I tied it to the end and I climbed up in the tree. The coon was sitting in a little bit of a fork in the limb of the tree. The coon was sitting in a fork of a limb. Taking my switch, I whopped him a good one out, and out he came. He sailed out over the river with a loud splash. He hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped off the bank after him. They were no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other bank, he ran down river. Climbing down out of the trees, I picked up my axe and lantern and trotted to the other riffle and waded across. I could tell by the bawling of my dogs that they were close to the coon. He could have He would have to climb a tree or be caught on the ground by my two dogs. All at once, their voices stopped. I stood still, waited for them to bawl. Nothing happened. Thinking the coon had taken to the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank. I waited, waited. I could hear nothing. By then, I knew he hadn't crossed over the river. I thought perhaps that they had caught him on the ground, and I hurried on. I came to a point where a slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. It means kind of a hill. So you've got clear water pouring into the river on one side, and on the other side is kind of a long bluff, like a hill. The slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. I could hear one of my dogs over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was little Ann. She swam across and came up to me, staying with me for just a second. She jumped back in the slough and swam back to the other side. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern high over my head, I could see dimly the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she stayed in one place of about 25 yards, never leaving that small area. She ran down to the water's edge and stared out into the slough. The horrible thought that came that old Dan had drowned. The horrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in water by climbing on his head and forcing him down into the water. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough, climbed up over the bluff, and came down to where little Ann was. She was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. I tied my lantern on a long pole, held it out over the water, and looked for old Dan's body. I could see clearly in the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere. I sat down on the bank, buried my face in my hands, and I just started crying. I was sure he was gone. Several minutes passed, and all that time little Ann had never stopped, running here, running there along the bank. She kept sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge. I got up and went over to her. She was digging in a small hole about the size of a big apple. Wow. Like this. She's digging into a hole into the ground. It was the air hole for a muskrat den. I pulled little Ann away from the hole, knelt down and put my ear to it. I could hear something and feel a vibration in the ground. It was an eerie sound and seemed to be coming from far away. I listened. Finally, I understood what all the noise was. It was the voice of old Dan. Little Ann had opened up the hole enough with her digging so his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he'd gotten into that old muskrat den. I knew that down under that bank in that water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeves, I tried to find my way with my hand. I had no luck. It was far too down. There was only one thing to do. Leaving my axe and lantern, I ran for home. Picking up a long-handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I had dug old Dan out. He was a sight to see. Nothing but mud from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. I held onto his collar and led him down to the river to wash him off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough. After washing him, I turned him loose. Right back into the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still in there. Working together, we dug him out. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so smart. His right front foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he must have been caught in a trap and had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Tired, muddy, wet, and hungry, I started for home. I've often wondered how old Dan got into that old muskrat den. Perhaps there was another entrance I had overlooked. I'll never know. One night, far back in the mountains, in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pulled a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving its scar in the form of fallen timber, twisted and snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was a wonderful place to hunt as it abounded with game. My dogs had struck the trail of a coon about an hour before. They had really been warming him up. I knew that it was about time for him to take up a tree, and sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the world he had a coon up in the tree. I was trotting along, going to him, when his voice stopped. I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why, and was a little scared, for I just knew that something had happened. And then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had been before, and I felt much better. When I came up to see the tree, I thought little Ann had treed old Dan. She was sitting on her haunches, staring up and bawling at the tree. There, good 15 feet from the ground, was his hind legs planted firmly in the center of a big limb, and his front feet against the trunk of the tree stood old Dan bawling for all he's worth. He's like way up in a tree, like somehow got up in this tree, and he's sitting up there bawling up there. So he's got little Dan down here, little Ann down here, old Dan here, and they're all bowling up higher up in a tree. That's hilarious. Above him, some 8 or 9 feet, was a baby coon. Oh, I was glad it was a young one, for if it had been an old one, he would have jumped out. Old Dan would have followed, and he surely would have broken all his legs if he would have jumped out of that tree. From where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to have climbed the tree. It was dead and more of an old snag than a tree itself, with limbs that were crooked and twisted. The bark had rotted away and fallen off, leaving the trunk bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet up to that first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree. There had to be a solution somewhere. Walking around to the other side, I saw how he had accomplished this feat. There in the bottom was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and could see another hole which had been hidden from me because of old Dan's body. Old Dan had simply crawled up into that hole at the bottom, climbed up the hollow of the tree, and worked his way out onto the limb. In some way, he had turned around and reared up, placing his front feet against the trunk. There he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down, and I was afraid to climb it for fear it would scare the coon into jumping out. If he did, old Dan would jump too and break his legs. I ran plan after plan around in my mind. None would work. I finally came to the conclusion that I had to climb the tree and get a hold of that crazy old dog of mine. I blew out my lantern, pulled off my shoes and socks, and started shinnying up the tree, praying that the coon wouldn't jump out. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made it up to old Dan and grabbed his collar. Oh my gosh. Grabbed his collar. I was so excited about grabbing his collar. I sat down on the limb and held him tight. He would bawl now and then and all but burst my eardrums. I couldn't drop him to the ground, and I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there on that limb and hold him all night. I would be no better off when daylight came. Glancing at the hole by my side gave me the solution to my problem. I thought, if he came out of the hole, he can go back in the hole. And that was the way I got my dog down from the tree. This had its problems too. In the first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in that hole head first. By scolding, pushing, shoving, and squeezing, I finally got him started on his way. Like a fool, I sat there on the limb waiting to see him come out at the bottom, and come out he did. Turning around, bawling as he did, right back into the hole he went. There was nothing I could do but sit and wait for him to come back on up. I understood why his voice had stopped for a while. He just took time out to climb a tree. Putting my ear to the hole, I could hear him coming. Grunting and clawing, up he came. I helped him out of the hole, turned him around, and crammed him back in. That time, I wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on that limb, and my bare feet were getting cold. I stared it down the same time he did. He beat me down, looking over my shoulder. I saw him turn around and head back for the hole. I wasn't far from the ground, so I let go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good to my feet when I landed. I jumped to the hole just in time to see the tip end of his long tail disappearing. I grabbed it, Holding on with one hand, I worked his legs back down with my other and pulled him out. Stopped his tree climbing by cramming rocks and chunks back up into that hole. How the coon stayed in that tree, I'll never know. But stay he did. With a well-aimed rock, I scared him out. Old Dan satisfied his lust to kill. I started for home. I'd had all the hunting I wanted to do that night. Wow. Chapter 10. What an interesting chapter, huh? What are some of the things that you experienced in that? What did you learn? Is hunting easy? Is hunting something that just comes and he just gets to sit back and relax while his dogs just do all the work? Oh, it's hard work. It's long nights. It's bare feet. It's climbing trees. It's risking the possibility that you might lose a dog. And I think that that's one of the things that I noticed in this one that I had never heard before, is that he recognized how he could maybe, I don't know, they seem to be a good team. They seem to work together. They seem to need each other in a way that what would happen if something happened to the other one. And that's kind of one of the thoughts that came to my head while I was working today, while I was reading today. Mr. Brown, I'm kind of surprised old Dan can climb too. I think that was pretty cool. This guy is not unwilling. Yeah, Xavier, you see it too, right? Like, what an amazing set of animals. They both have these powerful skills, probably like a best friend in your life, right? Like somebody who you spend time with all the time, and they have things that you can't do and they do better, and you have things that they can't do and you do better. Yeah, I love it too. Well, listen, guess what? Chapter 10 is done, and it is time. I don't know where you are right now, but if you're here in Georgia, sure is a pretty day. A little windy. Good day to fly a kite. Maybe find a hole to climb up in a tree. Maybe imagine what it's like to be barefoot and falling on flint rock. Anyway, more importantly, tomorrow we will be back together and we will read chapter 11. So thank you very much for being here. Until we speak again, please stay safe. Please go hug somebody that you care about. Please giggle and pay attention to the fact that this is a really interesting time that we're living in, but more importantly, that you're alive. And today is a very, very important day. It's the only one you got. Have a good day. I love you lots. Thanks so much for coming, and come back tomorrow. I'll miss you until then.